June 19, 1944, 90 miles west of the island of Guam. Altitude 20,000 feet. Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu, 25 years old, banked the wing of his F6F Hellcat and looked down. Beneath his wing, spread across the noonday Pacific sun, was a formation of Japanese aircraft flying in tight formation toward the American fleet. He tried to count them. He stopped at 40. There were more than that. He was alone with 3 wingmen. In the next 8 minutes, Vraciu would shoot down 6 Japanese Judy dive bombers. He would use only 360 rounds out of the 2,400 his Hellcat carried into the fight. When he landed aboard the aircraft carrier Lexington, he would hold up 6 fingers for the camera. That photograph would enter the pages of history. But the real story was not in those 6 aircraft. The real story was in a single question. Just 30 months earlier, these same Japanese pilots, or rather the men who had trained them, had shattered Pearl Harbor and ruled the Pacific sky for 2 straight years without serious challenge. So why, on this June morning in 9944, were they dying so easily? The answer was not in Vraciu's cockpit. It was 900 miles to the west, in a windowless room aboard the aircraft carrier Taiho, where a 57-year-old man had spent his entire career preparing for this moment, and was about to discover that he had prepared for an entirely different war. The Pacific Ocean, in June of 1944, did not look like a battlefield. From 20,000 feet, it looked like an endless plate of hammered silver, marked only by the wakes of ships too small to matter at that altitude. But in the second week of that month, something began moving across that silver surface that would decide the course of a war. On the 15th of June, the United States Marine Corps landed on the beaches of Saipan. Saipan is not a name most Americans knew before that summer. It is a volcanic island roughly 14 miles long, part of a chain called the Marianas that sits in the middle of the Western Pacific like a set of stepping stones. To the Japanese Empire, those stepping stones led directly to the home islands themselves. To the American commanders planning Operation Forager, they led somewhere even more important. They led to airfields. Airfields close enough to allow a new bomber called the B-29 Superfortress to reach Tokyo itself. Everyone in the Japanese High Command understood what the loss of Saipan would mean. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo understood it. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo understood it, and most importantly, aboard the fleet gathering in the Philippine Sea to answer the American invasion, Vice Admiral Ozawa understood it with complete and terrible clarity. Ozawa was 57 years old that summer. He was one of the tallest officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, over 6 feet in a service where 6 feet was rare. Colleagues who served with him described a man of quiet intensity, formal in bearing, respected by his subordinates for his fairness rather than any warmth. He had spent his entire career studying naval aviation, championing carrier warfare inside a service that had traditionally worshipped battleships. Now, in the summer of the Empire's most desperate hour, he was given command of what remained of Japan's carrier fleet, and told to stop the American advance before it reached the inner defensive ring. His flagship was the carrier Taiho, 29,000 tons of the newest, most heavily protected warship the Japanese Navy had ever built. Her flight deck was armored with 3 inches of steel, designed specifically to shrug off the kind of bomb hits that had gutted the older carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at Midway 2 years earlier. Her sister ships in the mobile fleet included Shokaku and Zuikaku, both veterans of Pearl Harbor. Together with 6 lighter carriers, Ozawa commanded 9 flight decks and roughly 450 aircraft. On paper, it was a formidable force. It was the largest carrier fleet Japan had assembled since the disaster at Midway. The plan Ozawa carried into the Philippine Sea was called Operation Ago, and it was built on a single elegant idea. His aircraft could fly farther than the American aircraft. His Zeros, stripped down and carrying drop tanks, could reach targets 300 miles away. The American Hellcats and dive bombers could reach only about 200 miles. That 100-mile gap, called outranging in the naval academies of Tokyo, was supposed to be the war-winning advantage. Ozawa would launch his strikes from beyond the reach of the American fleet, hit the enemy carriers, land his surviving aircraft on the airfields at Guam, Tinian, and Rota to refuel and rearm, then attack a second time on the return flight. It was, in theory, a beautiful plan. The problem was that Ozawa did not know something crucial. The airfields he was counting on no longer existed. Between the 11th and the 13th of June, 4 days before the Marines waded ashore at Saipan, another American admiral had taken his own fleet to those islands and systematically destroyed every airfield the Japanese had built there. His name was Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher, and he commanded Task Force 58. Mitscher was also 57 years old that summer. He and Ozawa were almost the same age. But that was where the similarities ended. Where Ozawa was tall and formal, Mitscher was small and weathered, a wiry man with a face burned brown from decades on open flight decks. Where Ozawa spoke in careful, measured sentences, Mitscher rarely spoke at all. His pilots called him the bald eagle behind his back, partly for the way he sat on the flag bridge, with his baseball cap pulled down against the sun, partly for the sharp, silent way he watched everything that happened on his ships. Mitscher had been flying since 1916. He had piloted one of the first American aircraft ever to attempt a transatlantic crossing. He had commanded the carrier Hornet on the mission that launched Jimmy Doolittle's raiders against Tokyo in April of 1942. He had commanded aircraft at Midway, at Guadalcanal, at every carrier battle that had shaped the Pacific War. When he stood on the flag bridge of his flagship, the carrier Lexington, in the second week of June, 1944, he was looking down at the largest carrier force ever assembled in human history. Task Force 58 consisted of 15 aircraft carriers, 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. It carried roughly 900 aircraft, of which 475 were Grumman F6F Hellcats. It was so large that it was divided into 4 separate task groups, each one a fleet in its own right, spread across an operating area of more than 1,000 square miles of ocean. And every one of those ships was there for a single reason: to defend the invasion of Saipan against exactly the kind of counterattack Ozawa was now sailing to deliver. The two admirals had never met. They would never meet. But over the next 72 hours, they would fight the largest carrier battle in the history of the world. And one of them would come away with the naval air arm he commanded, reduced to a shattered fragment of what it had been that morning. To understand why, you have to understand the two aircraft that would meet each other over the Philippine Sea. Because those aircraft were not just machines. They were the physical expression of two completely different philosophies about how a nation should build a fighter plane. And by the summer of 1944, one of those philosophies was 3 years out of date. The Japanese aircraft was called the Mitsubishi A6M0. In the summer of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, it was arguably the finest carrier fighter in the world. It could turn tighter than any Allied aircraft it faced. It could climb faster. It could fly farther. Its two 20mm cannons could tear apart the light, unarmored fighters and bombers the Americans and British sent against it in the opening months of the Pacific War. Japanese pilots called it Raizen, the Zero fighter, and they trusted it the way a cavalryman trusts his horse. But the Zero paid a price for those qualities. To achieve its extraordinary agility, its designers had stripped away almost everything that added weight. There was no armor plating behind the pilot's seat. There was no armor around the engine. There was no self-sealing rubber lining inside the fuel tanks. If a bullet struck a Zero's fuel tank, the fuel poured out. If a tracer round followed that bullet, the aircraft ignited. If a machine gun burst hit the cockpit, the pilot had nothing between him and the incoming rounds but a thin aluminum skin. In 9,941, those trade-offs made sense. Japanese pilots were the best trained naval aviators in the world. They flew against opponents who had not yet learned the Zero's weaknesses. Getting hit was, in the calculations of Japanese doctrine, something that would not happen very often to a properly trained pilot. By the summer of 1944, both halves of that calculation had collapsed. The Grumman F6F Hellcat entered service in the late summer of 1943. Its designers at the Grumman factory on Long Island had spent months studying a nearly intact Zero that had been captured on an Aleutian island called Akutan in July of 1942. They had cross-referenced that captured aircraft against pilot debriefings from every major air battle of the previous 18 months. And they had built the Hellcat around a single, ruthless design principle. It did not need to outturn the Zero. It needed to survive long enough to kill the Zero on its own terms. The Hellcat weighed nearly 12,000 pounds fully loaded. That was almost twice the weight of the Zero. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2000 800 double Wasp engine that produced 2,000 horsepower, roughly double the horsepower of the engine in the Zero. It carried more than 200 pounds of armor, plating shielding the pilot, the oil cooler, and the fuel system. Its fuel tanks were lined with layered rubber that expanded on impact, sealing bullet holes before fuel could leak. Its windscreen was made of laminated glass 1.5 inches thick, capable of stopping a rifle-caliber round fired at point-blank range. And it carried 6 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. Each of those guns fired roughly 850 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity near 2,900 feet per second. When all 6 fired at once, they delivered a stream of lead so dense that a 2-second burst could sever a Zero's wing at the root, or open its engine block, or turn its unprotected fuel tank into a fireball. None of this made the Hellcat as nimble as the aircraft it was built to fight. In a slow, tight-turning contest at low altitude, a well-flown Zero would still defeat a Hellcat almost every time. But the American pilots flying the Hellcat were being trained specifically to refuse that kind of fight. They were being taught in classrooms and gunnery ranges all across the United States that the Zero's greatest strength became its greatest weakness the moment you refused to play its game. That was the second philosophical difference. And in some ways, it mattered even more than the aircraft themselves. By the summer of 1944, the United States Navy was producing new naval aviators at a rate of roughly 10,000 pilots per year. Each of those pilots logged approximately 525 hours of flight time before ever reaching a combat squadron. That total included 150 hours in the specific aircraft they would fly in combat. They were taught deflection, shooting on gunnery ranges that fired at moving targets. They were taught energy management, the discipline of using altitude and speed as reserves to be spent and recovered. They were taught the tactic called boom and zoom, in which a fighter dives from high altitude, attacks in a single fast pass, and climbs back to altitude without ever slowing down enough to give the enemy a chance to turn inside him. Most importantly, they were taught to fly in coordinated pairs and 4-plane divisions, protecting each other, calling out threats over the radio, refusing to break formation for individual glory. The Japanese naval training program in the summer of 1944 was a different story entirely. In 1941, a new Japanese naval aviator arrived in his combat squadron, with roughly 700 hours of flight time behind him. He had trained for close to 3 years. He had fired his guns at towed aerial targets. He had flown mock combat against instructors who had themselves fought over China. When he was strapped into a Zero for his first patrol, he was one of the most thoroughly trained military pilots in the world. By June of 1944, the average Japanese naval aviator arriving in his squadron had roughly 275 hours of flight time. He had trained for 6 months. He had never fired his guns at a moving target because the aviation gasoline required for extensive gunnery practice no longer existed in the quantities training would demand. He had learned formation flying, basic navigation, and takeoffs and landings, and then he had been sent to sea. The gap between those two numbers does not sound catastrophic. In practice, it is the difference between a professional and an amateur. It is the difference between a pilot who reflexively knows what his aircraft can and cannot do, and a pilot who is still consciously thinking about the controls when the enemy appears. And it was not just the young men who paid that price. It was the veterans too, because every veteran in the Japanese Naval Air Service in June of 1944 had already survived, something no American pilot had to survive. He had watched his generation die. Consider a man named Zenji Abe. In June of 1944, he was 28 years old and served aboard the light carrier Junyo as a dive bomber pilot. He had been flying since before Pearl Harbor. He had, in fact, flown in the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, launching from the deck of the carrier Akagi on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, as part of the second wave. He had watched the American battleships burning from his cockpit. He had come home a hero. In the 2.5 years between that morning and the summer of 1944, Zenji Abe had flown at Midway. He had flown at the Eastern Solomons. He had flown from airfields in the endless grinding war of attrition over Rabaul and the Northern Solomon Islands, where the finest pilots of the Japanese Naval Air Service had been fed into a battle they could not win and had died there one by one, day after day, month after month, until the squadrons that had opened the war no longer existed as coherent units. By the summer of 1944, Zenji Abe was one of the last men still flying who could remember what it had felt like to be part of that generation. The men he had trained with, drunk with, played cards with in ready rooms across the fleet. In 9,941 were almost all dead. The pilots who now sat around him in the ready room of the Junyo were boys. They had names and faces and hopes for after the war, but many of them had less flight time than he had accumulated in a single month back in 1941. He did not tell them this. There was nothing to be gained by telling them. He simply watched them and understood, in the private space behind his professional composure, what was going to happen when they met the enemy. This was the human reality Ozawa carried with him aboard Taiho as his fleet steamed east toward the American task force in the second week of June. On paper, he had 450 aircraft. In practice, roughly 2/3 of the men flying those aircraft had never seen combat before. Some of them had never even landed on a moving carrier deck before. Their training had ended so recently that the fuel required to teach them proper carrier landings had been rationed away long before they graduated. Ozawa knew this. His staff knew this. The captains of the carriers under his command knew this. But no one had a better plan than Operation A-Go. There was no better plan available. The Marines were on Saipan. The airfields the plan had been designed around were gone. And if the mobile fleet did not sail out to meet the American carriers now, in this moment with these pilots, the war was over anyway. So they sailed. On the American side, no one knew any of this in detail, but Mitscher and his intelligence officers knew enough. They knew the Japanese fleet was at sea and moving to intercept them. They knew from months of aerial reconnaissance and submarine reports that the pilot quality on the Japanese side had been declining steadily since Guadalcanal. They knew that the new Hellcats had already proven themselves in a dozen smaller engagements over the previous 6 months, running up kill ratios that made the older Wildcat era look almost even. But knowing all of that, in the abstract, was not the same as knowing what would happen when the two forces finally met. Mitscher had commanded carriers for long enough to understand that battles, especially carrier battles, had a way of producing surprises that no intelligence report could predict. He had seen Midway. He knew that a single well-placed dive bomber could turn a battle in 90 seconds. He was not complacent, and he did not allow his staff to be complacent either. His plan was defensive. He would not chase Ozawa across the Pacific looking for a fight. His orders from Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet, operating from the cruiser Indianapolis, were absolute. Task Force 58 existed to protect the invasion of Saipan. It would not leave its station off the Marianas, even if the enemy fleet appeared within striking range. It would fight the battle it was given, on the ground of its own choosing, close enough to the beachhead that no Japanese ship could slip past it and reach the vulnerable transports offshore. That decision, made by Spruance and enforced by Mitscher, would become one of the most controversial orders of the entire Pacific War. Some of Mitscher's own officers thought it was too cautious. Some believed then, and some believed for decades afterward, that Spruance had thrown away an opportunity to annihilate the Japanese carrier fleet entirely by refusing to sail west and force a decisive engagement. That argument would rage in naval war colleges for the next 40 years. But on the morning of the 18th of June, none of that debate mattered yet. What mattered was that 15 American carriers were arrayed in a defensive box east of the Marianas, and 9 Japanese carriers were closing from the west at flank speed, and somewhere between them the largest air battle in human history was about to begin. On Taiho, Ozawa attended a briefing in the ship's operations room with his senior staff. The mood was somber but not defeated. They had submarine reports placing the American fleet roughly where they expected it to be. They had confirmed the range advantage of their aircraft over the American aircraft. They had planned 4 separate strike waves for the following morning, staggered to keep continuous pressure on the American defenses. The first wave would launch at dawn. If everything worked as intended, the American carrier decks would be burning by noon. Aboard Junyo, Zenji Abe sat in his ready room and cleaned the flare pistol he wore in his flight suit. Around him, the young pilots of his squadron were writing letters to families they knew they might never see again. Some of them were praying. Some were talking too loudly, laughing at nothing, the way frightened men often do. Abe said little to any of them. He had learned long ago that, on the night before a battle, veterans and boys inhabit different worlds, and there is no bridge between the two. Aboard Lexington, Mitscher sat in his flag quarters with a cup of coffee and read the latest reconnaissance report. His face gave away nothing. When he finished the report, he set it down carefully, walked out onto the flag bridge, and stood for a long time watching the sea. His staff officers watched him watching the sea and knew better than to interrupt. Aboard the destroyer picket ships stationed 30 miles east of the main task force, radar operators kept their scopes running through the night. Every hour on the hour they logged their contacts. Every hour on the hour the contacts were the same. Empty ocean. Nothing incoming. Somewhere to the west, still beyond the range of any radar in Task Force 58, Ozawa's fleet steamed on through the darkness. His 9 carriers held formation with their escorts. His 450 aircraft sat chained to their flight decks, fueled and armed, waiting for the dawn. And in the ready room of one of those carriers, a boy who had graduated from flight school 10 weeks earlier lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember what his instructors had told him about combat. He remembered fragments. He remembered the maneuvers he had practiced. He remembered the diagrams. He remembered nothing that felt useful when the ceiling above him began to vibrate faintly with the sound of the ship turning into the wind to begin launching operations. The sun rose on the 19th of June, 1944. The two philosophies that had shaped naval aviation in the Pacific for the previous 3 years were about to meet each other in open combat on equal terms, with the fate of an empire in the balance. One of them had been built around the individual skill of the pilot. The other had been built around the coordination of the fleet. Within 8 hours, only one of them would still be standing. Dawn on the 19th of June came slowly to the Philippine Sea. The horizon glowed a pale grey for almost an hour before the sun itself broke the water's edge, and by the time it did, both fleets were already awake and moving. Aboard the carrier Taiho, deck crews had been working since 3 in the morning. They wheeled Zero fighters out of the hangar bays on elevators that carried them up into the still dark air of the flight deck. They chained the aircraft in place, checked fuel lines, hung belts of ammunition on the wings, and stepped back as ordnance men wrestled bombs onto the racks beneath the D-4Y Judy dive bombers and the B-6N Jill torpedo planes. It was heavy, careful work performed in the cold hour before dawn, and the men who did it knew what the day ahead was meant to accomplish. At 6:29 that morning, Vice Admiral Ozawa gave the order to launch. The first wave rose from 3 carriers simultaneously. 16 Zero fighters, 45 Judy dive bombers, and 8 torpedo planes lifted off the decks of Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku and climbed into the pale morning sky. 69 aircraft in the opening blow, not the massive strike of legend, but the calculated first strike of a plan that would deliver 3 more waves before the day was over. Their heading was roughly 100 degrees east. Their target was somewhere out beyond the horizon, where the American task force was believed to be steaming in its defensive formation off Saipan. The pilots of that first wave climbed to a cruising altitude of 20,000 feet and settled into the long overwater flight. Below them, the ocean shone. Ahead of them, empty sky. Behind them, the mobile fleet grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. They did not know that they had already been seen. 200 miles to the east, aboard the destroyer USS Stockholm, a radar operator watched a cluster of blips form on the western edge of his scope. He called the range and bearing to his combat information center. The information moved through the fleet in under a minute. By 10 minutes past 10 in the morning, the fighter director officer aboard the carrier, Lexington, was already plotting intercept vectors, and the first Hellcats of the Combat Air Patrol were being ordered to intercept a raid that was still more than 100 miles away. This was the thing Ozawa did not know, could not know, would never fully understand until the war was over. The American fleet could see him coming. The technology that made this possible was called the SEXAM and SK radar systems, mounted on the mastheads of American cruisers and carriers. Under ideal conditions, they could detect an incoming aircraft formation from as far as 150 miles away. Coupled with them was something even more important. A room hidden deep in the belly of each American carrier called the Combat Information Center. In that room, under red lighting to preserve night vision, officers stood around a large glass plotting table. Beneath the glass, sailors moved small illuminated markers with long pointers, updating the position of every aircraft in the sky, friendly and enemy alike, every few seconds. Radar operators called out ranges and bearings in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Radio operators listened to a dozen channels at once. And at the center of it all stood the fighter director officer, a man whose job was to look at that entire picture and issue orders to the fighter squadrons over the radio. The fighter director officer could see the whole battle. He could see which of his squadrons had fuel and ammunition to spare. He could see which enemy formations were most dangerous. He could vector individual divisions of Hellcats to specific altitudes and specific compass bearings, positioning them above and ahead of the incoming Japanese aircraft, so that when the two formations finally met, the Americans were already in the sun, already at superior altitude, already turning in for the attack. Nothing like this room existed on any Japanese carrier. Japanese fighter direction, when it existed at all, was handled by voice radio from the bridge, based on lookouts with binoculars. The Zero pilots flying combat air patrol over Ozawa's fleet that morning would spot incoming American aircraft with their own eyes, or not spot them at all. There was no plotting table. There was no fighter director officer. There was no room where a battle could be seen whole. That single difference, more than the airplanes themselves, more than the training gap, more than any single thing that would happen over the next 14 hours, was the reason the day would end the way it did. At 10:23 in the morning, the first American Hellcats made visual contact with the incoming Japanese raid. They had been climbing for 20 minutes on radar vectors. They arrived at 24,000 feet, which was 4,000 feet above the Japanese formation. They arrived out of the eastern sun, so that any Japanese pilot who looked up would see nothing but glare. They arrived in numbers, more than 50 Hellcats from 3 different squadrons converging on the same target from 3 different bearings, all coordinated by the same fighter director officer, aboard the same carrier 80 miles away. The Japanese pilots in the first wave did not see them until the Hellcats were already diving. What happened next was over in less than 15 minutes. A division of Hellcats from Fighting Squadron 15, launched from the carrier Essex, was led by Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell. McCampbell was 34 years old that summer, a career naval aviator who had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1933 and spent the intervening decade waiting patiently for a war he had always believed would come. He had commanded Air Group 15 for 6 months. This was his first major air battle. Before the sun set on the 20th of June, he would become the third-ranking American ace of the entire Pacific War. And before the war was over, he would hold the record for the most enemy aircraft shot down in a single mission by any American pilot in history. But on the morning of the 19th, all of that was still ahead of him. McCampbell rolled his Hellcat into a diving attack from 24,000 feet. He picked out a Judy dive bomber near the front of the enemy formation, closed the range to less than 300 yards, and fired a 2-second burst from all 6 of his 50 caliber guns. The Judy caught fire almost instantly. Its right wing separated from the fuselage. What was left of the aircraft rolled onto its back and fell. McCampbell did not slow down to watch it fall. He was already accelerating past 400 miles per hour on his diving attack, and he zoomed back up to altitude before any surviving Zero fighters in the formation could turn on him. From the top of his climb, he rolled over, picked out another target, and dove again. Within 8 minutes, McCampbell had shot down 5 Judy dive bombers and would add 2 Zeros before the day was over. His wingmen accounted for another 8. The entire formation of Japanese aircraft they had intercepted, less than an hour after leaving Taiho's deck, no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. Some of the survivors turned and ran for home. Some, disoriented, kept flying east toward the American fleet, only to be picked off one by fresh Hellcat divisions arriving on new radar vectors. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese wave, 42 never came home. The men who did come home, those few pilots who broke free of the American fighters and turned back for the mobile fleet, brought with them a story that no one aboard Ozawa's carriers wanted to believe. They had been ambushed. They had been jumped from above by an enemy that seemed to know exactly where they would be and when they would arrive. They had not fought a battle. They had walked into a slaughter. Ozawa's staff, receiving these reports over garbled radio channels from returning pilots, filed them away as the exaggerations of shaken men and prepared to launch the second wave. The second wave was already in the air. At 8:56 that morning, roughly 90 minutes after the first wave had launched, Ozawa gave the order to send the second strike. This one was larger. 128 aircraft lifted off the decks of the fleet's larger carriers, including 48 Zero fighters, 53 Judy dive bombers, and 27 Jill torpedo planes. It was meant to be the killing blow, the wave that would find the gaps torn in the American defenses by the first strike and drive through them to reach the American flight decks. The problem was that the American defenses had no gaps. The Hellcats from the first intercept were already back aboard their carriers, refueling and rearming. Fresh squadrons that had been held in reserve were airborne on new patrols. The same fighter director officers who had directed the first slaughter were reading their radar screens and preparing new intercepts, and the second wave of Japanese aircraft came into their range at almost exactly 11 o'clock in the morning. Among the Hellcat pilots waiting for them was a 25-year-old lieutenant named Alexander Vraciu. Vraciu was the son of Romanian immigrants who had settled in East Chicago, Indiana. He had graduated from DePauw University in 1941 and enlisted in the Navy shortly after Pearl Harbor. He had learned to fly under Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first ace of the war, and by June of 1944, he had already shot down 12 Japanese aircraft in earlier engagements. He was, by any measure, an experienced combat pilot at the height of his ability, flying an aircraft that suited him perfectly. That morning, Vraciu led a division of 4 Hellcats from Fighting Squadron 16, launched from the carrier Lexington. He was climbing at 20,000 feet on a radar vector from his ship when he first saw them. The Japanese formation was massive. Vraciu began to count and stopped when he passed 40 aircraft. There were more spread out below him in loose formation, apparently unaware they had been seen, dive bombers making up the majority of the group. A screen of Zero fighters above and around them, all of them heading east toward the American fleet, toward the carriers. Vraciu had launched from that morning. 4 Hellcats against more than 40 Japanese aircraft. Vraciu did not hesitate. He pushed the nose of his Hellcat over and dove. What happened in the next 8 minutes became one of the most extraordinary individual combat records of the entire Pacific War. Vraciu closed to point-blank range on his first target, a Judy dive bomber flying near the rear of the formation. He fired a short, controlled burst from his 6 machine guns. The Judy exploded. He climbed away, rolled over, and dove again. His second target was another Judy. He closed the range, fired, watched the aircraft burn, and pulled up. His third target was a Judy that had begun taking evasive action, weaving through the sky in a desperate attempt to shake the Hellcat pursuing it. Vraciu closed anyway. He fired. The Judy went down, then a 4th, then a 5th, then a 6th. 6 Japanese dive bombers destroyed in 8 minutes by 1 American pilot, flying 1 American aircraft. Vraciu used approximately 360 rounds of ammunition to do it, out of the 2,400 rounds his Hellcat carried into the fight. The economy of it was almost inhuman. Every burst was short. Every target was confirmed. Every shot was calculated for maximum effect and minimum waste, the direct measurable product of a training program that had spent months teaching him deflection shooting on gunnery ranges in Florida and California, long before he ever saw an enemy aircraft in person. When he finally broke off and turned for home, his engine steaming from the sustained combat, 6 columns of smoke marked the sky behind him. Where 6 dive bombers meant to strike, the American fleet had instead struck the ocean. Their bomb loads still attached, their targets never reached. Vraciu landed aboard Lexington shortly after noon. The photograph that would become one of the most famous images of the Pacific War was taken on her flight deck a few minutes later. Vraciu, 25 years old, his flight jacket wrinkled, his hair matted with sweat, holding up 6 fingers to the camera. The camera captured a young man who looked less like a hero and more like someone who had just done a job and was tired. Behind him, the flight deck was crowded with other Hellcats, returning from other engagements, each with their own stories to tell. Because Vraciu's kills, extraordinary as they were part of a much larger pattern that was unfolding across the sky above the Philippine Sea that morning. Of the 128 aircraft in the Japanese second wave, only 97 ever reached the vicinity of the American fleet. Of those 97, the great majority were shot down by Hellcats before they could reach their targets. The handful of Japanese pilots who did break through the fighter screen ran headlong into the second layer of American defense. That second layer was the anti-aircraft fire from the escorting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of Task Force 58. And it was in the summer of 1944, more deadly than anything any Japanese pilot had ever encountered before. The reason was a technology so secret that even most of the American sailors firing it did not know how it worked. It was called the proximity fuse, also known as the VT fuse. Each 5-inch anti-aircraft shell fired from an American ship contained a tiny radio transmitter and receiver in its nose. The transmitter sent out a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced back from a nearby object, an enemy aircraft, the receiver detected the return, and the shell detonated automatically at the precise moment it was closest to the target. For 20 years, anti-aircraft gunners had faced an almost impossible problem. To hit a fast-moving aircraft, you had to time the fuse on your shell to detonate at the right altitude at the right instant. It required calculations no gun crew could reliably perform. The result was that most anti-aircraft shells detonated either too early or too late, throwing shrapnel into empty air. The proximity fuse solved that problem. It did not need to hit the aircraft directly. It only needed to pass close to the aircraft. And when it did, it detonated, throwing shrapnel into the target from a range that made a lethal hit almost automatic. The Japanese pilots who broke through the fighter screen in the second wave that morning were flying into a curtain of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire so dense that surviving American accounts described the sky above the fleet as being filled with continuous black smoke. Aircraft that would have survived a similar attack in 1942 or 1943 were being knocked down at ranges from which they could not even see the ships they were trying to attack. A single-duty dive bomber managed to hit the battleship South Dakota with a 500-pound bomb. The bomb killed 27 American sailors. It was the only significant hit any Japanese aircraft would achieve on any American ship during the entire 2-day battle. Everything else was slaughter. But while the air battle was reaching its climax above the fleet, another battle was unfolding beneath the surface of the sea. And in that battle, Japan was losing something that could not be measured in aircraft or pilots. At 9:10 in the morning, roughly 40 minutes after Ozawa launched his first wave, the submarine USS Albacore was patrolling submerged at periscope depth in an area her captain had chosen, based on a hunch about where the Japanese fleet was likely to appear. The captain's name was Commander James Blanchard. He was 39 years old, a career submariner from Louisiana, and he had been in position for less than an hour when the largest target he had ever seen through a periscope came into view. It was Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. 29,000 tons of the newest and most heavily protected aircraft carrier in the Japanese Navy, steaming directly across Albacore's bow at a range of less than 3 miles. Blanchard set up a firing solution. His fire control computer, one of the most sophisticated pieces of naval technology of the entire war, malfunctioned at the critical moment. Blanchard did not have time to fix it. He fired 6 torpedoes on visual bearings alone, aiming by eye through the periscope, hoping that at least one would find the target before Taiho steamed past. What happened next has been debated in naval histories ever since. 5 of Blanchard's torpedoes missed. The 6th was on a perfect course to strike Taiho amidships. A Japanese pilot named Sakio Komatsu, who had just taken off from Taiho and was still climbing away from the ship, spotted the torpedo's wake in the water below him. According to accounts pieced together after the war, Komatsu deliberately dove his aircraft into the torpedo's path, sacrificing himself to protect his ship. The details of what Komatsu did in his final moments have never been fully verified. Different Japanese sources give different accounts. What is certain is that at least one of Blanchard's torpedoes was destroyed before it reached Taiho. But one more got through. At 9:13 in the morning, 3 minutes after Blanchard fired, a single torpedo struck Taiho on her starboard side, forward of the bridge. The explosion was not spectacular. It flooded a few compartments. It jammed the forward aircraft elevator in its shaft, and it ruptured a fuel line carrying aviation gasoline from the ship's storage tanks to the aircraft on the flight deck above. To almost everyone aboard Taiho, the hit seemed trivial. The ship was still making full speed. Her flight deck was still operational. She continued launching and recovering aircraft as though nothing serious had happened. Her armored construction had done exactly what her designers had promised it would do. She had absorbed a torpedo hit that would have crippled an older carrier and shrugged it off like a mosquito bite. That was the impression. It was wrong. Deep inside Taiho's hull, aviation gasoline was leaking from the ruptured fuel line into the compartments below the hangar deck. The fumes were building up, invisible and heavy in the enclosed spaces, filling passageways with vapor that only needed a spark to become a bomb. The ship's damage control officer, a man whose name has largely been lost to history, made a decision that would determine everything that followed. He ordered the ventilation system turned on to full blast throughout the affected sections of the ship. His reasoning was straightforward. The fans would draw the gasoline vapor out of the leaking compartments and disperse it before it could accumulate to dangerous levels. His reasoning was catastrophically wrong. The ventilation system did not disperse the vapor. It circulated the vapor. It pulled gasoline fumes out of the compartments near the torpedo hit and pushed them through ducts and passageways into other compartments throughout the ship. Within an hour, gasoline vapor was accumulating in spaces hundreds of feet from the original leak, in engineering spaces near heat sources, in electrical panels crackling with live current, in compartments where sailors were smoking cigarettes because no one had told them anything was wrong. For the next 6 hours, Taiho steamed steadily through the Philippine Sea, launching and recovering aircraft, her armored flight deck bristling with defiance, her hull silently filling with a mixture of gasoline vapor and air that grew closer to an explosive concentration with every passing minute. And Ozawa, standing on her flag bridge, saw none of it. His attention was fixed on the air battle. His attention was fixed on the wave of aircraft he had already launched, and the third wave he was preparing to launch. And the reports coming in from returning pilots that suggested his strikes were penetrating the American defenses and causing serious damage. Those reports were fabrications. His pilots, disoriented in combat and traumatized by what they had seen, were mistaking their own aircraft going down in flames for American ships burning. But Ozawa had no way to know that. He had no independent means of verifying pilot claims. He had no aerial reconnaissance to confirm damage. He was flying blind on the reports of shaken men, and those reports told him he was winning a battle he was actually losing on a scale that would eventually be difficult to describe. At noon, roughly 3 hours after Taiho was torpedoed, a second American submarine found a second target. The USS Cavallo, commanded by Commander Herman Kostler, was patrolling in a different sector of the Philippine Sea when the carrier Shokaku came into her periscope. Kostler could not believe his luck. Shokaku was the veteran of nearly every major carrier battle of the Pacific War. She had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor. She had fought at Coral Sea. She had fought at the Eastern Solomons. She had fought at Santa Cruz. She had absorbed damage that would have sunk lesser ships and returned to service every time. She was, along with her sister ship Shokaku, the most experienced and battle-hardened carrier in the Japanese Navy. Kostler fired 6 torpedoes. 4 of them struck home. The first torpedo hit near the forward aviation fuel storage. The explosion ignited gasoline that had been loaded aboard for aircraft still being armed on the flight deck. Within minutes, Shokaku was on fire from her bow to her forward elevator. Damage control parties fought the flames with everything they had, but the fire kept spreading, and armed and fueled aircraft parked on the hangar deck began to explode one by one, tearing holes in the ship's internal structure that no damage control party could contain. At noon, Shokaku had been steaming in formation with the mobile fleet, her decks full of aircraft, her crew going about their duties. At 3 in the afternoon, she rolled onto her starboard side and sank, taking more than 1,200 men down with her. Among them were most of the pilots who had been aboard, many of them veterans of every major carrier battle since Pearl Harbor. Their skill and experience accumulated over 2.5 years of the hardest kind of learning, gone with the ship that had carried them. Ozawa received word of Shokaku's sinking sometime after 3 in the afternoon. He was still aboard Taiho. He was still receiving encouraging reports from his returning pilots. He still believed he was in the middle of winning a decisive battle. At 2:32 in the afternoon, 40 minutes before Shokaku sank, something happened aboard Taiho that no one has ever been able to fully explain. It might have been a spark from a generator. It might have been a cigarette. It might have been static electricity from a metal tool striking a bulkhead. Whatever it was, somewhere deep inside the ship, in one of the compartments now filled with the accumulated gasoline vapor of 6 hours of ventilated leakage, something ignited. The explosion tore through Taiho from the inside out. Her armored flight deck, the deck her designers had built to withstand almost anything an enemy bomb could deliver, buckled upward from below. Her hull plating, unprotected against internal blast, blew outward in sheets. Her aircraft elevators became chimneys of fire, funneling flame upward into the sky. Within minutes, the entire ship was ablaze from her keel to her superstructure. Secondary explosions from her own bomb magazines tearing through decks that had been intact only moments before. Ozawa, standing on the flag bridge, was thrown against a bulkhead. When he could stand again, he saw that his flagship was dying beneath his feet. His staff officers began urging him to transfer his flag to another ship. He refused at first. He wanted to remain aboard Taiho and continue directing the battle. His staff insisted. The ship was clearly doomed. Command of the fleet had to be preserved. Eventually, Ozawa yielded. He was transferred by boat to the heavy cruiser Haguro, and from there later to the carrier Shokaku. He took with him nothing but the clothes on his back and the flag that had flown from Taiho's mast. The charts, the radios, the operational plans, the accumulated communications equipment that had allowed his staff to coordinate the day's battle. All of it went down with the ship. At 4:28 in the afternoon of the 19th of June, 1944, Taiho rolled onto her port side and sank in 2,800 fathoms of water. She had been in commission for less than 4 months. She was the newest and most heavily protected carrier in the Japanese Navy. She died not because an enemy bomb had penetrated her armor, but because a single fuel line had ruptured and a single damage control officer had made a single wrong decision. By the time the sun began to set on the 19th of June, the pattern of the day was clear to almost everyone in Task Force 58, and clear to almost no one in the mobile fleet. Of the 450 aircraft Ozawa had committed to the day's 4 attack waves, more than 300 had been shot down or forced to ditch in the open ocean. Of those aircraft, the vast majority had been destroyed by Hellcats, before they could reach the American fleet. Of the pilots aboard those aircraft, hundreds were dead and most of the survivors were floating in life rafts they had no reasonable hope of being rescued from. American losses for the day totaled 29 aircraft. Some of those had been shot down by Japanese fighters. Some had been lost to anti-aircraft fire from Japanese ships. Some had simply run out of fuel and ditched near friendly destroyers. The ratio was better than 19-1. Somewhere in the sky above the Philippine Sea that evening, the last surviving pilots of the fourth wave were still trying to find a carrier that would still be there when they arrived. Some of them would never find one. Some of them would ditch in the open water and be picked up by destroyers. Some would simply disappear. Aboard the retreating ships of the mobile fleet, Ozawa began the slow work of understanding what had happened to him. He knew he had lost Taiho and Shokaku. He did not yet know how few of his aircraft had survived. He was operating on the incomplete reports of shaken men, and those reports still suggested that significant damage had been inflicted on the American fleet. He made his decision. He would withdraw westward under cover of darkness. He would refuel and regroup, and in the morning he would continue the fight. He gave the order to withdraw at 7 in the evening. He did not know it, but the fight, in any meaningful sense, was already over. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots would soon begin calling it, had ended by sunset. Everything that came after was postscript, and somewhere aboard the light carrier, Junyo Zenji Abe, 28 years old, veteran of Pearl Harbor, sat in his ready room and listened to the debriefings of the young pilots who had returned from the day's engagements. There were not many of them. Those who had returned were shaken in a way he had not seen before, not even at Midway, not even in the worst days of the Solomons. He said nothing to them. He listened, he watched their faces, and in the private space behind his professional composure, he understood something that no one aboard the retreating fleet was yet ready to say out loud. The generation of Japanese naval aviators that had opened the war at Pearl Harbor was gone. The generation that had replaced them had died today. Whatever came next would not be flown by pilots in the way this war had been flown so far. The Empire had one more day of fighting left in it. Then everything would change. The night of the 19th of June passed slowly for both fleets. Aboard the retreating mobile fleet, Vice Admiral Ozawa spent the hours after sunset trying to piece together a picture of what had happened to his command. He had transferred his flag from the burning Taiho to the heavy cruiser Haguro, and from Haguro he was now making his way toward the carrier Shokaku, one of the few flight decks he had left. His radios worked poorly. His communications staff had gone down with Taiho. Reports from surviving ships came in slowly, contradicted each other, and were often based on the impressions of officers who had themselves seen only a fragment of the day's action. By midnight, Ozawa had reached a conclusion. He had suffered serious losses. He had lost 2 of his best carriers. But he still believed his pilots had inflicted heavy damage on the American fleet. The reports coming in from surviving aircrew described burning American carriers and columns of black smoke on the eastern horizon. Ozawa had no reason yet to know that those reports were mistaken, that the burning aircraft his pilots had seen going down were almost entirely their own. He gave the order to withdraw to the northwest, refuel from the fleet's supply tankers at dawn, and continue the battle on the 20th. In his mind, the fight was not yet lost. It was merely paused. 275 miles to the east, Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher was making his own calculations. Mitscher knew almost as little about the enemy condition as Ozawa knew about his own. His scout planes had lost contact with the mobile fleet as darkness fell. He knew he had won a great victory. He knew his pilots had shot down staggering numbers of Japanese aircraft. But he did not know where Ozawa was now, how many of his carriers remained afloat, or whether the Japanese admiral would try again in the morning. He wanted to find out. He wanted to sail west through the night and be in position to launch a search at first light. He wanted to finish what his pilots had begun. He could not. The reason was a 57-year-old admiral sitting aboard the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, several hundred miles to the east. His name was Raymond Ames Spruance, and he commanded the 5th Fleet. Task Force 58 belonged to him. Mitscher answered to him. And Spruance had made a decision that would define the entire battle of the Philippine Sea and haunt his reputation for the rest of his life. Spruance had ordered Task Force 58 to remain close to Saipan. His reasoning was simple. His mission, as defined by his orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz, was to protect the invasion of Saipan. Nothing in those orders authorized him to abandon the beachhead in order to chase down the Japanese fleet. If any part of Ozawa's force slipped past Task Force 58, while the American carriers were sailing west, the transports and supply ships supporting the Marines on Saipan would be defenseless. That was a risk Spruance was not willing to take. Some of Mitscher's officers thought Spruance was being too cautious. Some of them believed then, and would believe for the rest of their lives, that Spruance had thrown away a chance to annihilate the Japanese carrier fleet entirely. The argument would rage in the wardrooms of the fleet through the night of June 19th, through the years of war that followed, through the decades of peace after Japan surrendered. Books would be written about it. Careers would be built on defending or attacking the decision. War college seminars would debate it for the next 50 years. But on the night of the 19th of June, the argument was academic. The order had been given. Task Force 58 would not sail west until dawn. The dawn of the 20th of June came without contact. Mitscher launched scout planes at first light, sweeping arcs of ocean out to the maximum range they could search. They found empty water. They found more empty water. They flew for hours, and they found nothing. Ozawa's fleet had used the night well. It had put distance between itself and the American task force, and now it was somewhere out there in a vast ocean, waiting. Hours passed. Mitscher paced the flag bridge of Lexington and said little. His staff watched him and knew better than to speak. The morning became noon. The noon became afternoon, and still the search planes found nothing. At 3:42 in the afternoon, a scout plane from the carrier Enterprise finally spotted the mobile fleet. The location was 275 miles to the northwest. Mitscher looked at the plot and calculated. 275 miles was near the outer limit of his aircraft's combat radius. A strike launched now would reach the target in approximately 2 hours. That would place his aircraft over the enemy fleet in the last hour of daylight. The return flight would be conducted in darkness. Some of his pilots, especially the younger ones with little night flying experience, would not survive that return. He also knew that if he did not launch, Ozawa would escape. The mobile fleet would slip away into the night, refuel from its tankers the following day, and fight again another time. Whatever damage had been done on the 19th would be all the damage that would be done. The Japanese carrier force, wounded but still afloat, would return to the war. Mitscher made the decision that defined his career, launched the strike. At 4:10 in the afternoon, 216 aircraft began lifting off the flight decks of Task Force 58, Hellcats to escort. Dive bombers loaded with 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs. Torpedo planes carrying the heavy fish that were meant to open a carrier's hull below the waterline. 216 aircraft, and every pilot in every cockpit understood the arithmetic before he ever released his brakes. They had enough fuel to reach the target, strike it, and turn for home. They had almost nothing in reserve for searching, circling, or correcting a wrong heading in the dark. Some of them, perhaps many of them, were not going to come back. They flew anyway. The strike found the mobile fleet in the last hour of daylight. The light was already fading, the sun dropping toward the western horizon, when the American aircraft descended out of the gathering dusk and delivered their attacks. Of the more than 400 Japanese carrier aircraft that had flown into battle on the morning of the 19th, fewer than 36 operational fighters remained to defend the fleet on the evening of the 20th. Those 30-odd Zeros rose to meet the American strike, and they fought with the desperate courage of men who understood that this was almost certainly their last flight. They were swept aside within minutes. The Hellcats cleared the sky above the fleet, and the American dive bombers and torpedo planes went to work. The carrier Taiho, one of the fleet's older converted merchant hulls, took torpedo hits in her engineering spaces. Fires spread through her interior. Her power failed. She slowed, stopped, and began to burn from the waterline up. Around 8 in the evening, she rolled onto her side and sank. Shokaku, the veteran of Pearl Harbor, absorbed several bomb hits that started serious fires on her flight deck. Her crew fought the flames for hours and eventually saved the ship. Chiyoda took a bomb hit that damaged her flight deck but did not stop her. 2 fleet oilers were sunk. Several other ships were damaged. By the time the American aircraft turned for home, the sun was already gone. What followed was the part of the battle that no manual had prepared any pilot for. The flight home was more than 250 miles over open ocean, in complete darkness, with fuel gauges that had already dropped below the level that any pilot would have accepted on a peacetime training mission. Radio channels filled with the voices of men reporting engines starting to sputter, requesting bearings, asking whether anyone else could see the fleet's silhouette against the stars. Some aircraft ditched in the water while their engines were still running. Their pilots, knowing that a controlled landing on the sea in darkness was better than the alternative of running dry over open ocean and falling with a dead engine. Others flew on. They squinted into the dark ahead of them and prayed to see the outline of a carrier that they could bring their aircraft down onto before their fuel ran out. Aboard Task Force 58, Mitscher was making another decision. His fleet had been operating under blackout conditions for the entire war. American carriers did not show lights at night. Lights at night meant submarines. Lights at night meant every Japanese picket ship within 100 miles knew exactly where you were. Lights at night were, in the doctrine every American naval officer had learned in his career, an invitation to disaster. Mitscher gave the order to turn the lights on. Every carrier in Task Force 58 illuminated her flight deck. Truck lights burned along her masts. Signal lights blazed from her superstructure. Star shells fired from destroyers illuminated the sky above the fleet. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers turned themselves into a chain of beacons stretching across the ocean, visible for miles in every direction. A fleet that had spent 3 years learning to hide in the dark, now offering itself up as a target so that its own pilots could find their way home. It was a risk no doctrine sanctioned and no manual recommended. It was a decision made by a commander who had decided that the men who flew the day's mission would not be abandoned to the dark for the sake of caution. The pilots overhead saw the lights and turned toward them. What followed was chaos. Aircraft landed on the wrong carriers because in the dark they could not tell one ship from another. Aircraft landed with dead engines, gliding onto flight decks with nothing left in their tanks. Aircraft crashed on approach, clipping their wings against parked planes, breaking their landing gear, sliding off the sides of ships into the water. Deck crews worked by floodlight and flashlight, dragging damaged aircraft clear of the landing area within seconds of each touchdown, so the next pilot circling overhead had a clear deck to aim for. Some aircraft never made it back at all. They ran out of fuel and ditched in the darkness. Destroyers detached from the screen and swept the water with searchlights through the night, pulling men from rafts and from the open sea, working through hours no one would ever forget. By dawn on the 21st of June, the ledger was closed. Approximately 80 American aircraft had been lost on the return flight from the strike against Ozawa's fleet. Some had been shot down. Most had simply run out of fuel and ditched or crashed on landing in the dark. It was the highest single mission loss rate the American carrier force had suffered since the darkest days of 1942. But most of the pilots survived. Destroyers picked up the vast majority of the men who had gone into the water. Of the roughly 216 airmen who had flown the strike, only 49 were lost. The rest were pulled from the sea, some within an hour, some not until the following day, but pulled from the sea nonetheless. Mitscher's decision to turn on the lights had cost him something. It had saved him far more. The final accounting of the 2 days of battle told a story that even the American commanders who had won it had difficulty processing. Japan had lost 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio. She had lost approximately 600 aircraft between the 2 days of fighting and the accompanying losses on land-based airfields in the Marianas. Most importantly, she had lost the pilots who had flown those aircraft. Hundreds of trained aviators, veterans and novices alike, were dead. The naval air arm that had struck Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific for 2 years had ceased to exist as a coherent offensive force. American losses totaled about 123 aircraft. Fewer than 50 of those had been lost to enemy action. The rest had been lost to fuel exhaustion and night landing accidents during the return flight on the evening of the 20th. Personnel losses were far lower. Perhaps 76 American airmen were killed in the 2 days of fighting. Every American ship in Task Force 58 was still afloat. Every American carrier was still combat effective. The pilots who returned to their carriers on the 21st began, almost apologetically, to describe what they had experienced in the sky above the Philippine Sea. The engagements had been so one-sided that several of them, comparing notes in ready rooms across the fleet, began using the same phrase to describe what they had done. It had felt, they said, less like air combat and more like an old-time turkey shoot back home. The name stuck. Within days it had spread through the fleet. Within weeks it had reached the American press. And within months, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had entered the language of American naval history as the shorthand for the day the Japanese carrier force had ceased to be a threat. But among the men who had actually flown the mission, the phrase carried an uneasy edge that the newspaper accounts never quite captured. It was not really a boast. It was closer to an admission. The battle had never been the desperate contest that either side had expected it to be. It had been something else, something the American pilots had not been entirely prepared to feel comfortable with. They had trained for years to fight the Japanese Naval Air Service on equal terms. What they had discovered in the summer of 1944 was that the terms had never really been equal at all. Not since 1943, perhaps not since Guadalcanal. The industrial and training gap between the two nations had opened so wide, so quickly, that by the time the two fleets finally met in the summer of 1944, the outcome had been decided before the first Zero left Taiho's flight deck. The pilots who had done the shooting were not celebrating that morning. They were writing letters home, and they were quietly in ready rooms across the fleet, trying to understand what it meant that the enemy they had trained for years to fear had turned out to be no match for them at all. For Ozawa, the reckoning came slowly. Over the course of the 21st and 22nd of June, as the mobile fleet limped westward and the true scale of the pilot losses became clear, Ozawa understood at last what had happened to his command. He submitted his resignation immediately. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, refused to accept it. The Empire needed every experienced flag officer it had left, and there were battles still to come. Ozawa did not know it, but the next great battle would come only 4 months later, in the waters off the Philippine island of Leyte. And in that battle, Ozawa would command what remained of Japan's carrier fleet in an operation whose purpose was not to sink enemy ships, but to serve as a decoy. Because by October of 1944, the carriers that had survived the Philippine Sea no longer had enough pilots or aircraft to fight a real carrier battle. They existed only to lure the American fleet away from the beaches where the Japanese battleships would try to break through. Ozawa's carriers would fulfill that mission. All 4 of them would be sunk. It was the price of a plan built on the assumption that empty flight decks were worth more as bait than as fighting ships. That was the shadow the Philippine Sea cast over everything that followed. The controversy over Spruance's decision to hold Task Force 58 close to Saipan did not fade with time. It grew. Mitscher himself, in his after-action report, gently but unmistakably suggested that a more aggressive posture might have destroyed the Japanese fleet entirely. Other senior officers were less gentle. Admiral William Halsey, who commanded the alternate command team that would take over the same task force later in the year, made it clear in private conversations that he would have handled things differently. Halsey would get his chance in October. His chance would produce its own controversy, its own second-guessing, its own decades of debate. The truth is that no one has ever settled the argument, and no one ever will. Spruance did what his orders told him to do. He protected the invasion of Saipan. He won a lopsided victory that permanently broke the Japanese naval air arm. He did not win the total annihilation that some of his critics believed was within his grasp. Whether that was a failure of nerve or a triumph of judgment depends entirely on what you believe an admiral's job actually is. What is not in dispute is what the Battle of the Philippine Sea accomplished. Saipan fell to the Marines on the 9th of July, 3 weeks after the naval battle ended. Within months, American B-29 bombers were flying from airfields on the island toward the Japanese home islands themselves. The strategic bombing campaign that would eventually reduce 67 Japanese cities to ruins began from those airfields. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August of 1945 were assembled on Tinian, one of the islands in the Marianas chain, that had been secured because Task Force 58 had defeated the mobile fleet in June of 1944. None of that would have happened if Ozawa had won. Somewhere in a Japanese naval hospital in the summer of 1945, a 28-year-old veteran named Zenji Abe wrote in his journal about what he had seen in the Philippine Sea and afterward. His words, translated and published decades later, described a moment of clarity he had experienced. On the evening of the 19th of June, standing on the flight deck of the Junyo as the last surviving pilots of his squadron tried to make it home in the dying light. He had watched the empty spaces on the flight deck where aircraft that would not be returning had been parked that morning. He had watched the mechanics standing beside toolboxes they no longer had a use for, and he had understood in that moment that the war he had been fighting since Pearl Harbor was over. Not officially, not on any calendar, but in every way that would eventually matter, the Empire had lost its ability to fight the war it had started. He would live through everything that came after. He would live through the firebombings. He would live through Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He would live through the surrender aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945. He would live for another 5 decades after that, long enough to visit the United States, long enough to meet American veterans of the same battles he had fought, long enough to sit down with the son of a sailor who had been killed at Pearl Harbor and shake his hand. And he would say, in the interviews he gave in his old age, that the moment the war truly ended for him was not August of 1945. It was the evening of the 19th of June, 1944, when he stood on the deck of a carrier that had launched aircraft that would never return and understood at last that everything he had trained for and believed in had already been overtaken by an enemy that had built something his own navy had never even begun to imagine. An enemy that had built not a better aircraft, though the Hellcat had certainly been that. Not a better pilot, though the American pilots had been better trained by any measure that mattered. Not a better fleet, though Task Force 58 had certainly been that. An enemy that had built a system that connected radar antennas to fighter director officers, that connected training programs to shipyards, that connected proximity fuses to combat information centers, that connected everything to everything else in a web of coordinated capability that no individual skill and no individual courage could ever overcome. In the sky above the Philippine Sea, on a June morning in 9944, the individual had met the system for the first time on equal terms, and the individual had learned what that meant.